You are worthless without me. These were the last cruel words Amara heard as her husband, Kelvin, threw her out into a freezing storm. 7 months pregnant, betrayed, and penniless, she was left to die on the unforgiving streets while he celebrated with his mistress inside their warm mansion. But Kelvin made a fatal mistake that night. He didn't just break a woman, he forged a survivor. What happens when the wife you discarded returns years later, not as a victim, but as a powerful force holding the keys to your destruction? This is a story of heartbreak, ultimate betrayal, and the most satisfying revenge you will ever witness. Before we begin the story, please leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The night Kelvin threw Amara out of the house, the rain in Lagos did not simply fall, it assaulted the earth. It beat against the pavement with a violence that mirrored the storm raging inside the sprawling, white duplex in Ikoyi. The heavy mahogany door swung open, not with a welcoming creak, but with a forceful slam against the wall. A suitcase, hastily packed and bursting at the seams, was hurled through the air. It hit the wet concrete with a sickening thud, the latch snapping open on impact. Tiny pink socks, soft knitted blankets, and a worn teddy bear spilled out into the mud, instantly soaked by the relentless downpour. Kelvin stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm, golden glow of the chandelier in the foyer. He looked like a titan of industry, a man who commanded respect. But in that moment, his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated cruelty. He didn't just look angry, he looked disgusted. He pointed a finger towards the dark, flooded street, his voice booming over the roar of the thunder. He told her to get out. He told her he didn't need her, and he certainly didn't need the baby she was carrying. The words were sharp, designed to maim, cutting deeper than any knife. He called her worthless. He told her she was nothing without him, just a relic of a past he had outgrown. Amara, 7 months pregnant and heavy with the child she thought would save their marriage, stumbled backward into the rain. The water soaked through her thin dress in seconds, chilling her to the bone. She scrambled to her knees, her hands grasping at the muddy pavement, trying to gather the scattered baby clothes. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal, raindrops mixing with the tears streaming down her face. She tried to plead with him, her voice cracking as she begged. She asked him where she would go. She reminded him of the life inside her, his child. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. From behind Kelvin, a silhouette appeared. Bianca. She moved with the languid grace of a predator who had already secured its kill. She was tall, sleek, and dressed in a silk robe that cost more than Amara's entire wardrobe. She held a glass of wine, looking at the scene with a bored, detached amusement. She didn't see a tragedy, she saw a nuisance being removed. She urged Kelvin to close the door, complaining about the damp air affecting her skin. The look she gave Amara wasn't one of hatred, but of total insignificance. To Bianca, Amara was just trash to be taken out. Kelvin looked at his wife one last time. There was no flicker of the man who had once held her hand in a tiny apartment in Ajagunle and promised her the world. There was only cold, calculating indifference. He told her she was useful when he had nothing, but now she was just in the way. With a final sneer, he stepped back and slammed the heavy door. The sound echoed through the night like a gunshot, final and irrevocable. The porch light flickered off, plunging Amara into absolute darkness. For a long time, she just stood there, the rain plastering her hair to her face, staring at the closed door. The house she had turned into a home, the walls that held her laughter and her tears, were now a fortress barring her entry. Inside, she could hear the faint sound of music starting up, followed by the clinking of glasses and Bianca's high, tinkling laughter. The contrast between the warmth inside and the freezing despair outside was physically painful. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled away from the gate, her mind a blank canvas of pain. She had no one. Her mother had passed away years ago, and her father, broken by a business failure he never recovered from, had followed not long after. Her friends were from her old life, a world she had left behind as she ascended into Kelvin's elite circle, a circle that had never truly accepted her. Now she was alone in the most populated city in Africa. Amara began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she couldn't stay there. The rich, manicured streets of Ikoyi were empty and silent, save for the drumming of the rain. Each step was a struggle against the wind and the weight of her own body. As she walked, her mind drifted back to a time before the mansion, before the money. She remembered the smell of jollof rice simmering on a single gas burner in their tiny one-room apartment. She remembered the sound of Kelvin's laughter as they shared a plate, their knees touching in the cramped space. Back then, he was just Kelvin, a young architect with big dreams and empty pockets. He would trace the lines of her palm and tell her about the skyscrapers he would design, the empire he would build. He had promised to give her everything, but he hadn't told her the cost. A sharp cramp seized her lower abdomen, pulling her violently back to the present. She gasped, doubling over, pressing a hand against her belly. She whispered to her unborn child, promising that they would be okay, but the words felt hollow. They weren't okay. She was homeless, penniless, and the father of her child had just declared them both garbage. The pain came again, sharper this time, a twisting knife in her gut. She leaned against a rough brick wall, her legs trembling. The world began to spin. The streetlights blurred into halos of fractured light. She felt a dampness between her legs that wasn't just the rain, and a cold dread seized her heart. Panic, raw and primal, tore through her. It was too soon. It was far too soon. She tried to push herself off the wall, to flag down a passing car, but the vehicle sped past, splashing dirty water onto her. To them, she was just a shadow, a vagrant to be ignored. Her strength was failing. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the wall, the rough brick scraping her skin. She lay on the wet pavement, the rain falling into her open eyes. She whispered a prayer, a desperate plea for her baby's life, as the edges of her vision began to darken. Through the haze, she saw a pair of headlights slow down. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, looking out of place in the storm. The passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. He held a large black umbrella, struggling against the wind. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit that was quickly getting soaked. He didn't look like the kind of man who stopped for strangers. He looked important, busy, a man with places to be. But as he hurried towards her, his face wasn't filled with annoyance. It was etched with concern. He knelt beside her, ignoring the mud ruining his expensive trousers. He asked if she was all right, his voice deep and calm, cutting through the noise of the storm. Amara tried to answer, but her voice was a broken whisper. Another wave of pain shot through her body, and her eyes rolled back. The man moved quickly, catching her before her head hit the pavement. He shouted for his driver. He gathered her into his arms. She felt terrifyingly light, and carried her to the car. The last thing Amara felt was the warmth of the leather seat and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with rain before the darkness took her completely. When she woke up, the world was white, sterile, blinding white. The smell of antiseptic filled her lungs, replacing the scent of rain and mud. She was in a hospital bed, hooked up to a tangle of tubes and monitors. Her body felt heavy, aching, but the sharp, tearing pain was gone. But so was the weight. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her hands flew to her stomach. It was flat. Panic seized her. She tried to sit up, a croaking sound escaping her throat. Where was her baby? A figure stirred in the chair beside her bed. It was the man from the rain. He stood up slowly, his face grave. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He simply looked at her with eyes that held a profound, ancient sadness. He told her the truth, the exposure, The stress, the trauma, it had induced premature labor. The doctors had performed an emergency C-section. The baby, a little girl, was born alive, but she was too small. Her lungs weren't fully developed. She had fought, he told her. She was a fighter, but she hadn't made it. Amara didn't scream. The sound that escaped her was a low, guttural moan, the sound of a soul shattering. She turned her face to the wall, curling into a fetal position, trying to protect a child that was no longer there. She named her Nettie in her mind. What God has given. A cruel irony now. The stranger, who introduced himself as Daniel, stayed. He didn't try to touch her or comfort her with words. He simply bore witness to her grief, a silent sentinel in the room of loss. In the days that followed, Amara moved through life like a ghost. Daniel took care of everything. He paid the hospital bills. He arranged the small, private funeral. He stood beside her at the graveside as they lowered the tiny white casket into the earth. It was just the two of them and the priest. Amara felt nothing and everything all at once. The guilt was a living thing, gnawing at her insides. She believed it was her fault. If she had been stronger, if she hadn't angered Kelvin, if she hadn't been out in the rain. After the funeral, Daniel didn't take her back to the streets. He took her to his home in Ikoyi. It was a mansion, grander even than Kelvin's, but it felt different. It was quiet. A deep, heavy silence hung in the air, settling like dust on the antique furniture. He led her to a guest room overlooking the garden and told her to rest. He introduced her to Mama Bisi, his elderly housekeeper, a woman with kind eyes and hands that seemed to know exactly when to offer a cup of tea or a warm towel without a word being spoken. Amara spent weeks in that room. She stared out the window at the lush garden, watching the birds, feeling a profound disconnect from the living world. How could the sun still shine when her world had ended? Daniel gave her space. He never intruded, never asked her for anything. He would leave books by her door or a vase of fresh flowers. In the evenings, she would sometimes see him sitting in the living room, reading, a solitary figure in a house built for a family. One evening, driven by a restlessness she couldn't name, Amara wandered the halls of the mansion. She found herself standing in front of a closed door at the end of the hallway. She pushed it open. It was a child's room, a boy's room, a bed made with superhero sheets, a shelf lined with toy cars, a desk with a half-finished drawing, but everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. The air in the room was stale, as if time had stopped there years ago. She heard a footstep behind her and froze. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry. He looked at the room with a raw, naked pain. He told her about his son Leo and his wife, Elena. They had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Since then, he had shut himself off from the world, burying himself in his work, hiding behind the high walls of his estate. He told her that when he saw her in the rain that night, he didn't just see a stranger. He saw the same look in her eyes that he saw in the mirror every morning, the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. That night, the wall between them crumbled. They were two broken souls, brought together by tragedy. They began to talk, not about the weather or politics, but about the things that actually mattered, the weight of grief, the guilt of surviving. Amara told him about Kelvin, about the betrayal, about the life she thought she had. Daniel listened, his jaw tightening, a cold fury building in his eyes as she described how Kelvin had thrown her out. As Amara regained her strength, she began to explore the house. She found solace in the garden, tending to Elena's overgrown rose bushes. She found peace in the kitchen, helping Mama Bisi cook, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables quieting her mind. She started to feel like herself again, not the naive girl who worshipped Kelvin, but a woman forged in fire. One rainy afternoon, while Daniel was out, Amara went into his library to find a book. On a high shelf, tucked away behind rows of leather-bound volumes, she noticed a wooden box. It looked old and out of place. Curiosity got the better of her. She climbed on a stool and took it down. Inside was a photo album. She opened it, expecting to see pictures of Daniel's late wife and son. And she did. But as she flipped further back, her heart stopped. There was a photograph of a young Daniel, scarcely 20 years old, standing on a construction site. Next to him, with an arm draped proudly around his shoulders, was her father. Her father looked happy, healthy, alive. Amara's hands trembled. She flipped the page. There were more. Daniel at her family's old house. Daniel having dinner with her parents. Her father handing Daniel a diploma. He hadn't just known her father. They had been close. Her father had been his mentor. Why hadn't he told her? Then she saw the documents underneath the album. Old bank statements, legal papers, and a file labeled Project Phoenix. She opened the file and saw a name that made her blood run cold. Kelvin Okoro. The sound of the front door opening startled her. She hastily tried to close the box, but Daniel was already at the library door. He saw the open album, the scattered papers. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He walked over and poured himself a drink, his back to her. He admitted it. He knew her father. Her father was the man who gave him his first chance when no one else would. He was the best man Daniel had ever known. Amara asked the question that was burning in her throat. Why did he keep it a secret? Daniel turned to her, his expression grim. He told her the story she never knew, the story of how her father's company really collapsed. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the market. It was sabotage. Kelvin had been her father's protege before Daniel. Her father had trusted Kelvin blindly, bringing him into a massive development deal. But Kelvin was greedy. He wanted it all, and he wanted it fast. Daniel showed her the evidence he had spent years collecting. Kelvin had created fake vendor accounts, siphoned millions of naira into offshore shells, and falsified safety reports. When her father began to suspect something, Kelvin had gaslit him, manipulating the board against him. The stress of the impending bankruptcy, the shame of the public scandal, that was what caused her father's heart attack. Kelvin hadn't just stolen the money, he had killed her father as surely as if he had pulled a trigger. And then, in a final act of twisted victory, he had married Amara, the daughter of the man he destroyed, to secure his legitimacy and ensure she never dug too deep into the past. Amara stared at the documents, the room spinning. The man she had loved, the man she had grieved for, was a monster. He had built his life on her father's grave. He had killed her father, and his cruelty had killed her daughter. She didn't cry. The tears were gone. In their place was a cold, hard resolve. She looked at Daniel and asked him why Kelvin wasn't in jail. Daniel explained that he had been building a case, waiting for the indisputable proof, waiting for the moment when he could bury Kelvin so deep he would never see the light of day again. He had hesitated to approach Amara before because he thought she was happy, that she had moved on. But now they had a common enemy. Days later, the past came knocking. Kelvin showed up at Daniel's gate. He had heard rumors that his dead wife was living with a billionaire. He came not out of remorse, but out of greed and jealousy. He pushed his way past the security, demanding to see Amara. When he saw her, standing in the foyer, healthy and glowing, he didn't apologize. He tried to gaslight her again. He told her he had made a mistake, that he was angry, that he loved her. He tried to spin a web of lies, accusing Daniel of being the one who ruined her father, trying to turn her against the man who saved her. But Amara was no longer the victim. She stood tall, listening to his lies with a detached calm. When Daniel stepped in, presenting the evidence of the fraud, Kelvin's mask cracked. He panicked. He admitted that her father's death was an accident, that they had argued, but he never meant for him to die. It was a confession, a partial one, but a confession nonetheless. Amara kicked him out, threatening to call the police. Kelvin fled, terrified, but the game was far from over. Amara told Daniel that prison wasn't enough. Kelvin cared about one thing above all else: his image. He wanted to be seen as a tycoon, a success story. She wanted to destroy that. She wanted to strip him of his pride before she stripped him of his freedom. They hatched a plan. The annual Lawson Foundation Charity Gala was approaching. It was the social event of the year. Daniel would invite Kelvin, dangling the bait of a massive partnership that could save Kelvin's failing finances. Kelvin, arrogant and desperate, would never refuse. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom of the Eco Hotel was a sea of diamonds and tuxedos. Kelvin arrived with Bianca, strutting like a peacock, believing he was about to seal the deal of a lifetime. Daniel met him, playing the part of the gracious host, and led him to a private VIP alcove to discuss business. The alcove was secluded, but what Kelvin didn't know was that it was wired. Hidden cameras and microphones were positioned to capture every word. Inside, Daniel poured Kelvin a drink and stroked his ego. He asked Kelvin how he had achieved such success so young. Kelvin, drunk on expensive champagne and the promise of more money, let his guard down. He laughed, he bragged. He told Daniel the real story. He mocked his late father-in-law, calling him weak and sentimental. He admitted to cooking the books, to stealing the money. He laughed about how easy it was. And then he talked about Amara. He called her a pathetic creature. He laughed about throwing her out in the rain, bragging that it was the best decision he ever made because it removed the dead weight. In the main ballroom, the lights dimmed. The giant screens behind the stage, usually reserved for charity videos, flickered to life. Kelvin's face, high definition and hideous in his arrogance, appeared for all to see. His voice boomed over the speakers, confessing his crimes, mocking the dead, and degrading his wife. The room went deathly silent. Hundreds of the city's elite watched in horror. Bianca, standing in the crowd, turned pale and tried to slip away, but security blocked the exits. In the alcove, Kelvin noticed Daniel wasn't laughing. He noticed Daniel was looking over his shoulder. Kelvin turned around. Amara stepped out of the shadows. She wasn't wearing the rags of a homeless woman. She was wearing a blood-red gown that hugged her form, looking every bit the queen she was meant to be. She walked past a stunned Kelvin, out onto the balcony that overlooked the ballroom. Kelvin chased after her, realizing too late what was happening. He ran out onto the balcony, only to face a sea of hundreds of people staring up at him with disgust. He looked at the screen, seeing his own face, hearing his own confession playing on a loop. Amara took the microphone. Her voice didn't shake. She introduced herself to the crowd. She told them she was the daughter of the man Kelvin had destroyed. She told them she was the wife he had thrown into the storm. She pointed at him, accusing him not just of theft, but of stealing a life, her father's and her daughter's. Kelvin tried to grab her, to stop her, but Daniel intercepted him, twisting his arm behind his back. The doors to the ballroom burst open, and a squad of police officers marched in. They weren't just beat cops. They were from the serious fraud unit. Kelvin fell to his knees. He looked at Amara, tears streaming down his face, the same fake tears he had used so many times before. He begged her. He told her he loved her. He pleaded for a second chance. Amara looked down at him. She leaned in close so only he could hear. She repeated the words he had said to her that rainy night. "You are worthless." She told him to look around. She was standing tall, surrounded by light, and he was the one in chains. The police dragged him away, his screams echoing through the silent hall. Bianca was arrested as an accomplice. The crowd erupted into applause, not polite clapping, but a thunderous ovation for justice served. Amara stood on the stage, Daniel by her side, and for the first time in a long time, she breathed freely. A year later, the sun shone brightly on a quiet street in Ajagunle. A crowd had gathered for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The sign above the building read, "The Little Dove Home, in memory of Nettie." Amara stood at the podium. She looked radiant. She had used every penny recovered from Kelvin to build this shelter. It was a sanctuary for women like her, women who had been discarded, abused, and left to face the storms of life alone. There was a daycare, a sewing workshop, and a legal aid clinic. Daniel stood in the front row, holding a small potted rose bush that he intended to plant by the entrance. He wasn't just a donor, he was a partner. In the years since the gala, their shared grief had blossomed into something beautiful, something sturdy and real. Amara cut the ribbon. Children ran into the playground, their laughter filling the air. She walked over to Daniel. He took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. He told her that her father would be proud. He told her that Leo would have loved this place. Amara looked at the shelter, then at the clear blue sky. She thought of the storm that had nearly killed her. She realized that the storm hadn't broken her. It had cleared the path for the woman she was meant to become. She had lost a life she thought she wanted, but she had found a purpose she never knew she needed. She squeezed Daniel's hand. They stood together, two survivors who had turned their scars into a lighthouse for others, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, promising a new day. Life may throw you into the storm. It may strip you of everything you hold dear. But remember, your value is never defined by those who hurt you. It is defined by the strength it takes to rise again. Even the darkest night will end, and the sun will always rise. Now, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Kelvin got the punishment he deserved, or was Amara's revenge too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. And please rate this story from 1 to 10. Your feedback helps me choose the best stories for you. If this video touched your heart, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories every week. Thank you for watching.